The next bits to cover are as follows. When we're talking about these analytics concepts that are useful, the whole idea is these are very popular metrics that are in play. If you start looking at each of these metrics, you can now start thinking of in terms of what are the things that actually add value to this. Or for example, if you're talking about break-even points, what are the characteristics that could reduce our break-even point? Because you want to reduce your break-even point. Reduction in break-even point basically means that you can start making money earlier on. The same story goes with payback period. So you use these as a mechanism to ask yourselves in your company, in your team, in your functional role or corporate role, that how is it that I can reduce my payback period? How is it that I can increase my return on investments? How is it that I can increase my net present value, future value of money, future value, and so forth? So payback period will try tackling this pretty swiftly, because I think you've got a good sense of what they are. So payback period is the time that it takes to recoup an investment. If you were to get money or borrow money, so it's important for us to understand the nuances of it. What are the different ways that a company can raise money? Anyone? So if your company wanted to start a project, what are the different ways you could raise money? Very good. You could have IPO, you could borrow money, which is borrowing money is nothing but debt structuring. Bonds, right? Bonds also a type of a debt structuring. In this case, you're promising somebody a certain yield. So you'd issue a bond, you're promising somebody a certain yield. If that yield is becoming, and they think there's a certain riskiness, reward that comes with it, they're likely to borrow. Very important in the process is understanding your basic structuring, which is capital structuring. And your capital structuring basically tells you to a certain degree, what's your debt to your equity. And we're not going to get into all the nuances of debt to equity, but it's still very important to just quickly cover that idea. And the nuance between debt and equity is that debt is, of course, you can raise it, you can borrow money from somebody else, but there's a note that comes with it, and you're borrowing on a note, which means there's a constant interest expense that comes with it. However, the key to whether you're going to choose debt, or whether you're going to go the way of debt, or you're going to go the way of equity. So it's typically called a D to E ratio. So your debt to equity ratio. Equity, on the other hand, doesn't require an expense. However, it automatically increases the dilution or it dilutes the amount of ownership that you have in a certain bit. It also means that you're also open to, or you're exposed or vulnerable to the caprices of the general public, as well as big institutions, and whether it's somebody who's a Wall Street analyst or someone who's basically posting a blog post on any kind of these street blogging, financial street blogging. So it's key for you to realize that your payback period, therefore, is also going to be dependent on not only how well you perform, but how well you understand how you're going to structure your capital and the investment that you're typically going to get. Now, this automatically brings us to something called a key thing that you hear all the time in your companies, and you run it all the time anyway, which is what we call as return to a return on investment. It's nothing but the value of an investment based on the ratio of the investment value and the investment cost, right? So return on investment is nothing but your total investment benefits minus total investment costs divided by your total investment costs. So if I were to ask you, if you have a project that has an expected return of 5% and a debt interest of 6%, would you invest? Would you start the project? Don't do it, right? And the whole idea is that as long as your project's return is 5%, you don't really want to, unless it's breaking. Now the key behind this is realizing two different things, which is this 6%, both of them are compounding over time. And as you're looking at the compounding bit, you know that you're losing 1 percentage point year on year at a compounding rate. And you would say that, surely I don't really want to do it. Now, as you look at this set, if you now were to say, all right, my expected return was 5% in the first year, and then 10% in the second year, and 8% in the third year, and 4% in the fifth year, would you now do it? And we're not going to get into the specifics of it, but the general structure would be you'd end up using something called the net present value. Because all you're going to do is you basically, again, we're not going to get into total depths of it, but your typical setup is, in this case, is, let's see if I can get this to work. Your net present value is going to be nothing but what you've spent, right? Initial investment minus returns over time. And that itself will say that, all right, which is equal to initial, let's say, so let's call it initial investment minus, this is nothing but the future value you're going to get times 1 plus I, which is, and anybody, what's I? What's I to the power of negative n? I is your interest. Now, typically, what would you choose as your interest before we move forward? So it's going to be key, right? So n is nothing but let's say it's not the easiest bit there. So in this case, n is number of periods and I is the discount rate or the interest rate. And what would you choose as what would be your choice of discount rate? So if I were to ask you that tomorrow you're setting up a new project and you want to get your project approved, and you have to typically show them that your project's going to end up giving you a positive return on the investment. And in order for you to show that, you have to figure out, apart from how much money you're going to make over time, what would be your what would be your choice of interest rate, and where are you going to get that number from? Anyone? Any idea where you're going to get your number from for choosing your interest rate? What's going to get very good? So one, of course, is your weighted average cost of capital, which is nothing but it's the weight of what makes up that investment, whether it's debt, the cost of debt, the cost of equity, the cost of preferred stocks, and so forth, to cover that, all right? And so that's one mechanism, in order, assuming you have to typically get a completely fresh new investment to get that bit done. Oftentimes you can also use things like, let me see if I can write it there, things like your IRR, which is your company might have its own internal rates of return that they want you to fulfill. You might say that you might get it, you might be able to get capital at a cheaper rate, but we typically want projects that at least internal, let's say, rate of return. We typically want to have a project that at least matches our internal rate of return, because with the cost of capital, as long as your project's return is greater than your weighted average cost of capital, you should say, sure, we should go ahead with it. But sometimes some companies would add a stipulation on top of that and say that you at least have to match our internal rate of return. The other, oftentimes, if you don't really have a number, including your weighted average cost of capital, and you still want to decide on something. So if you don't have a number, if you don't have a number on hand, you can now use, any idea what you would use? If you don't have a number, you can use what? What would be some of your recommendations? So suppose I come to you, a supplicant for information, asking you, we really don't have a weighted average cost of capital number because we really don't know, but we need to know what's the opportunity cost of choosing this project versus some other project, and we can't really figure out exactly what our discount rate ought to be. What would you sort of advise if I were to ask you that question? What should I choose as your discount rate, or as my discount rate? Anyone? Come on, somebody please. Very good. One option is average stock market returns. So you could say that, I just want to look at how the S&P 500 performs over a long period of term. And if you say that, all right, it performs at 8.25%, you'd say, there's my opportunity cost. I could just put my money into something like SPX, which is nothing but an index fund or an ETF version of S&P 500, and not worry about that. You could use a bank interest rate, but here's the interesting bit about a bank interest rate is you could say that's an interest rate, but it's an interest rate that's also floating, which basically means that interest rate is likely to might change in the short term, in the long term, with the change in administration, whether a different policy is made based on based on what Janet Yellen would say, or whoever the new Treasury Secretary is going to be affirmed as is going to mention. So bank interest rates basically are very, very good point, but they might be much more volatile. So the other option, therefore, is, so these are all good options: S&P, bank interest rates. So as Adam mentioned, the S&P bit, as Shiko mentions, the bank interest rate. The other option is, and I can't even write properly out here, so sorry if I'm fumbling around. The other option is using treasuries. sorry, not treasuries, but treasuries, mainly because a typical 10-year note gives you a general idea of stability in terms of inflation. So all you're saying is, I might not want to use the money, but if I don't use the money, because, and again, bank interest rate, think of it. What's the yield on a treasury? And the yield on a treasury typically is what? What's the treasury yield right now? About 2.5%. So about 2.5%. What's a bank interest rate? Yes, thank you. Yeah, it's about 2.5%. And bank interest rate is about half a percentage point. So you're saying that, so in this case, if you were to choose a half a percentage point, what you're basically saying is, if I were to keep my money aside for that I'd assigned to a project, the value of my money itself is depreciating over time. But for you to show that it's not at least going to deflate, because time will pass and the time value of money is going to make the value of the money go lower and lower and lower over time. I at least need to figure something that is inflation adjusted. And what's the only piece that's inflation adjusted? The response is, it's typically a treasury yield on a 10-year note or something like that. So oftentimes you could use that as your benchmark discount rate if you're ever making that calculation. Or, of course, if you want to become more conservative, the next bit is look at what your debt interest would have been. Third level is look at your weighted average cost of capital. The fourth and the most conservative, which typically also means it's a higher discount rate, is typically your internal rate of return. So it's important to pay attention to choosing these sets, because just by choosing a different rate, you could make the numbers look completely different. And you already know that very well. Everybody clear on that part? Yes? All right. Splendid. We won't talk about scheduled performance index. We might talk about it later when we branch onto doing scheduled predictions and so forth. We've talked about gross margin and net margin. By the way, we talked about gross margin, and could somebody quickly remind me what gross margin is? Anyone? Quick reminder. Very good. Profit minus costs of goods sold, and you're always trying to push down your costs. So it's always costs, right? It's COGS, which is the cost of goods sold, and it's important for you to push the cost down. What's net margin? And the minute it's margin, it automatically means it's a ratio. It's a ratio. Remember, anytime it's a margin, it's always a ratio. What's a net margin then? The net margin, or net margin in this case, is nothing but your net income after taxes, right? So this is typically EBIT. Some companies will be a bit more conservative and say we want it to be EBITDA, which is earnings before income, taxes, depreciation and amortization, and that makes you a bit more conservative, divided by your total revenues. Now, an interesting take on that metric, which might even be interesting for you and might be insightful for your own companies, would be to start looking at EBIT divided by, net margin divided by your gross margin, to see how good you are at expense management. See, gross margin tells you how good you are at cost management. But after you've got your gross margin, you've got your gross profit, after which all your expenses go into effect. And then from that you get your net profit, from which you take away your interest expenses and taxes and all that depreciation, amortization, to get your final net profit. But it doesn't really, neither of them separately tells you whether your net margin or your gross margin is a good idea of, or gives you good insights in terms of how good are you at expense management. So if you were to now divide net margin by gross margin, it's going to subtly show you to what extent, or you say gross margin minus net margin divided by gross margin. It'll subtly give you a much better sense in terms of how good are you at really managing your expenses, even though you've been typically good at managing your costs. So it's very, very important. The rest of them are not to worry tremendously about them. We'll revisit them over time. The other thing I want to talk to you about, but we'll not get into tremendous detail except when we start talking about predictive modeling and so forth, is something called is probability distribution. And we'll talk about it briefly, and I'll talk about it a bit more in length for your next distance learning set, where I'll post something. But a key in that of puzzle is something called, so if I were to, again, let's go and just hit it directly. If I were to ask you, what exactly is a probability distribution? Or what defines a probability distribution? What exactly is what is probability? Probability is nothing but the chance of something happening, right? And if you know that probability is a chance of happening, probability distribution is nothing but the chance of something happening when you take into perspective all things happening, right? So if you say that, all right, what is the chance that, what is the probability distribution of having a good career, or enhancing your career after an EMBA? You'd say, all right, is this probability distribution going to be something that is normally distributed? Is it going to be a skewed distribution, which is, will it look lopsided? Will it be not lopsided? Will it be... So again, Jamie, what is the birthday problem or paradox? Would you mind telling us what that is?
Yeah, so basically the birthday problem or paradox means that even though there are 365 days in a year, you could have 365 people in a room, but you're going to have a lot of birthdays that are closely, that are grouped together, and you're going to not find that everybody is going to have a day across the board.
That's a very, thank you very much, Jamie. That's a very nice take on it. So oftentimes what you'll find is this distribution, which means more, even though there might be many people in the room, it's not going to be distributed uniformly, which is, if you have 365 people in a room, and there are, say, 365 days in a year, you could say that, truly, it's likely that everyone would be born on each of the single day, and that would make it a uniform distribution. If you were to now plot it in terms of days of the year in the x-axis and number of people born on that certain day on the y-axis, it should be a straight line, assuming it were purely perfect set. But the probability distribution shows that there is a weird paradox to it, which is, even though you have 365 people and there are 365 days of a year, or you can even have the population of the world, 365 days a year, it's not going to be uniform. There's going to be a crest where there's a probability that more people were born on certain days or during a certain period than others. and it subtly changes the way we look at things, which basically becomes an important piece of the puzzle. So let's try and make a managerial implication of it. Now that you know the birthday paradox, suppose you're a store that focuses on birthday sales, or sales, focused on birthday-like events. Would you prepare yourself exactly the same way that you would for every single day of the year? And the answer is no. Once you know what the probability distribution is, you might find that loads of people ended up being born for, I'll just make up a specific set, between the times of, I don't know, August to October. So August to October is prime season for people being born based on your probability distribution, which basically would mean that given that you're now armed with that information, you'll say that I'm now going to stock up more things because there's likely to be more demand for birthday related material between the times of August to October, and the other times I'm going to run some interesting sales because there's a lower probability of people having very high demand for birthday things at that point of time. So it changes the way you even define how you want to place items, how you want to deal with items, how you want to price items. And of course, as we always know, high demand basically means you want to dampen it by also increasing your margin, right? So that you don't do a run out at one point of time and you're suddenly overstocked the other parts of the time. So most of the time, we assume that as we are moving into a population, it is normally distributed, which is things move right into the middle, and there are two tail ends where things are likely to happen less. The final bit, just to finish off, is something called, is it always true? So if I were to ask you, now look at 365 people that you've invited at a party, that they will follow the same probability distribution, the same angle of curve that you would have if you looked at the entire population? And the answer is no. It's likely because it's a small sample. The question that is the eternal question in sampling is, which we talked about in class last time, is does the sample truly represent the population? And the answer is the sample typically does not truly represent the population unless the sample is large enough so that it starts mimicking the population, which means that as you're moving from sample to population, what is truly the most clustered number of birthdays? So assume clustered number of birthdays, as we mentioned, was between August and October. As we truly move, so when you bring in 365 people for an event, you might find that in that group, the birthdays were more towards between April and September. So that's where the peak lies. And however, as you move closer and closer to getting more and more and more people together, it's going to now tend more and more towards August to September. Just the way we talk about truly the probability of getting a head or a tail is 50%. But if you were to sort of toss a coin once, you might just get a tail. Try it next time, you might get a tail again. Try the third time, you now might get a head, which is 2 out of 3 times, which is 66.66% of the time, you're getting a tail, and only 33% of the time you're getting a head. Now, try it multiple times. As you increase the number of times you try tossing the coin, you'll see that the probabilities of landing heads versus probabilities of landing tails will really start moving towards something called the central limit theorem. Start moving right into the middle and become 50%. and that oftentimes is the crux. By the way, thank you very much, guys. Any kind of, so I've tried to record this. I've tried to record it on two different sets, and including one, and I'll see which one works. I love to do these redundant bits because who. Thank you very much, guys. Have a wonderful weekend. Miss you, chaps, and I'm looking forward to meeting you physically. I'll have the projects. I'll have the first exercise graded in by tomorrow, and I'll always send you an email once I've graded them. And till then, enjoy, and looking forward to our next discussion. Bye, guys. Take care. Enjoy the day. Cheers.